Hey there, welcome back. So this is video number 3 on this book about the particular examination of conscience and the dominant defect. And this particular video is going to focus in on temperament. Knowing our temperament is really important because from it flow a whole lot of good and bad characteristics. And the bad ones have special bearing on our dominant defect. So if you want to know about your dominant defect and tackle that in the exam, you need to know about your temperament. So that's why we're going to focus on it here. Now, in my prior videos about this book, I tried to offer you all the main useful points that you would need in order to put the exam into practice. But for this section of the book, I really can't do that because Fr Fuentes has already done a great job of summarizing very compactly a whole lot of information about a whole lot of different temperaments. And if I was to make a summary of the summary, I think that I would oversimplify and misrepresent a lot of the information, and it wouldn't really be helpful to you. So in that case, what can I offer you here? My plan is to offer you some initial ideas about temperament that Father offers that I think are really good, and clarify some of the terms that he uses, since there are different schools of thought and discussion about temperament, and people use words differently. Then I will give you one of the particular temperaments that he describes in greater detail, so you can get a taste of what this chapter is mainly about. Okay, so the first section is going to be on terminology. It's important because a lot of the authorities that discuss temperament use the same words, but in different senses. So here, when we're talking about temperament, we're talking about all of the natural inclinations that arise in us simply because of the way that we are physically and psychologically. Like, we are born with these inclinations. But when we use the word character, we're talking about all of the tendencies that arise in us because of the work that we've done with our willpower to try and train and educate ourselves. So character is the results that we've reached through hard work to train and perfect our temperament. So this very distinction between temperament and character puts forward a really important truth, and that is that we can grow. We can both perfect the good aspects and overcome the bad aspects of our natural temperament. We can build a virtuous character within ourselves. The temperament is always sort of going to underlie and affect how we respond to things on the interior, but it doesn't necessarily have to determine how we act then on the exterior. We can educate that. Otherwise, the particular examination of conscience wouldn't really have any application. So for example, let's take a person who's naturally melancholic, and because of that is more prone to be envious of other people. So that person, using their intellect and will, can learn to respond in the opposite way and respond instead with humility and generosity. And not just to the point of doing what they should even though it's hard, but they can learn to act humbly and generously in a joyful way, with like a strength that comes from virtue. So these two terms, temperament and character, are really important to understand in their distinction and in their relation to each other as we go into the rest of Father Fuentes' chapter here. But before we do, I want to offer one note from personal experience, and it relates to the actual activity of sitting down to consider what our temperament may be. And my advice is that it takes some real reflection in order to distinguish carefully what elements there are in our temperament as distinct from the things that we have learned and gained over time through the formation that we've received. So let me give you an example. Perhaps at this point, you've lived a few decades, and at this point, you're quite good at interacting with and talking with other people. Like, socializing is something that you find satisfying. So at this point in your life, you might say, I think temperamentally, I'm a pretty sanguine, outgoing person. But if you reflect for a moment, maybe you might realize that in your childhood, actually, it was pretty difficult for you to get outside your box and talk to other people. And it took quite a few good friendships that you were blessed to have to really build into your capacity to be spontaneous and to enjoy conversing with other people. So it's something that you then realize, hold on, that's a virtue, social virtue that I built over time. So my actual temperament in that case is not an outgoing one. It's a more introverted temperament. And it's important then to make that distinction, to look back and say, actually, naturally, I think I'm more introverted, because that's then going to have bearing as you consider the other aspects of your character and how that introversion might affect them. At the same time, just looking back at how you were in your childhood is not a surefire way of understanding what your temperament is, because, okay, another example, maybe you were a very quiet child, but it was because you were being bullied. So when you found yourself later in life out of that situation and you could heal from it, you found that you flowered socially and you are actually a naturally very outgoing person and you were happy to be with people then. In that case, your childhood was not a good indication. And this is all just to illustrate for you the need to sort of reflect in a more extended way over what exactly your experiences point to in terms of underlying temperament versus the character that has been formed in you over the years. So with this all understood, we can move on to section 2, which is where Fr Fuentes first looks at the classical division of the temperaments, and then he offers a set of his own and defines them and summarizes them and sort of fills them out for you to consider. So the first part of that is looking at the classical division of the temperaments, and those were 4. The classic ones are phlegmatic, sanguine, melancholic, and choleric. And these are very helpful, and there are a whole lot of videos about this division of the temperaments, so I won't go into describing them too much. But Fr Fuentes says, as helpful as they are, they're a little bit broad. So Father himself offers 8. And so within these 8 temperaments described, we're going to find a lot of the characteristics of the classic 4 temperaments, but each one is described in a more specific way and with greater detail. So here again, I just want to remind you that among the temperaments, each of us is a composite of characteristics from various temperaments. There's no one individual instance of someone who fits into only one category of temperament. With that, I think it makes sense to just dive in and look at one of the individual temperaments that Father outlines for us. And the one that I've selected to show you guys is called the nervous temperament. Okay, so first some basic characteristics of someone with the nervous temperament. This temperament is emotive, meaning that the person responds pretty strongly to both external and internal stimuli. But their response is more on a short-term basis, and a lot of the feelings that result die off more quickly, and they return to the prior state that they were in before pretty fast. Also, someone with this temperament is a little bit less prone to action than someone like a choleric temperament would have, for example. So the emotional life of the nervous person is rich and varied, but their train of thought can be harder for them to control, and they can be more prone to, anxious and wandering thoughts. It can also be harder for them to see things in an objective light. Their joys and their anxieties and their sorrows are very intense, and they can change kind of rapidly. But at the same time, amid all the rapidity, the senses about things that they develop through repeated emotional experience can be very deep and long-lasting. People with this temperament often have a lot of artistic talent because their imaginations and their ingenuity is very rich, and artistic pursuits for them can yield a lot of enjoyment. But at the same time, the work itself, undertaking the work, this personality type can often have a lot of difficulty with consistency and undertaking things in a long-term way, building discipline and sticking to what they start. They can be excitable and even rebellious and show bursts of bad temper, but at the same time, when they realize that they've fallen or sinned or messed up in some way, they fairly easily come to remorse and want to do better. But despite this turning around and starting again, it's very easy for them then to forget the good resolutions that they've made to do better and fall back into the same problems. The nervous person's less given to abstract thought and deductive reasoning and functions more in an intuitive sort of way. And in their dealings with others, they're often in a sense sort of easily influenced. They very easily emotionally read the people that they're with, and they're good at harmonizing with those people in order to get along. And when they're with people that they get along with and respect, they can be very kind. So there you have a basic outline of that one temperament, the nervous type that Fr Fuentes outlines. And here, then he goes on to give a list of positive and negative aspects to that temperament. For example, on the one hand, the nervous type can be very attentive to the needs of others and very inclined to generosity and compassion. While on the other hand, they can also be inclined to starting many things without finishing any of them, and in general, a sort of sense of superficiality. So I won't go into all the positives and the negatives here now, but I think you can see like the utility, the helpfulness of having a big united description of many of the characteristics that often go hand in hand in one of the temperament types. We can all sit down and start, I think, considering ourselves and making important realizations about both our character and our temperament, but having these descriptions often reveals to us other aspects that we wouldn't have necessarily seen, for connections to things that we wouldn't have fully understood before in so much depth. Okay, and so with that brief look into the chapter, I think I'm gonna finish out this first series on book number 1 in the Virtue series. As always, it's really been neat to share these ideas with you, and I hope they're very helpful. Do please drop a comment below if you have any thoughts or questions, things you'd like to ask me, and I will certainly try to answer you. Same time, if you're interested in knowing more, especially about this third section of the book, please look below for the link where you can get this book for yourself. And lastly, do look out here for other videos about other books in the Virtue series that we're going to be putting up here. So with that, I simply commend all the efforts that we're undertaking to grow in virtue to our Mother Mary. May she intercede with us before her Son.